Welcome to Senghenydd. For those of you who saw the last video, you and I walked up here, and it is a rather hotter day than was forecast, so I'm a little bit sweaty, I think is the best way of putting it. But I'm pleased to be here because I wanted to tell the story of something that happened in this particular little village in the Welsh Valleys. Where I'm sitting right now is the site of universal colliery. And I mentioned in the last video that one of the reasons the line was built from Caerphilly up to Senghenydd was because of universal colliery. It employed a huge number of people. Every time a shift went down, there could be 900 people down there. Mostly men, but some of them were boys aged 14, 16, 18. It employed absolutely everybody. In some households, you would quite literally get father, sons, brothers, and possibly even lodgers working down the pit together. The first first test shafts were sunk around about 1895, and it opened not long after that and started shifting a lot of coal. There was no two ways about it. There were two pits, two actual shafts that went down. They were called Lancaster and York, and they led to different coal faces, east and west. And they had names which were very resemblant from the Boer War, so places like Mafeking and Pretoria. And it was fair to say that they did the job and they shifted a lot of coal. There's a problem with Welsh mines, and they were gassy. There was something called fire damp, which was mainly methane, but other gases in there. And when it ignited, it went up with a boom. Mix that in with coal dust, and you've got a potential for a pretty serious event. This is why matches were banned. This is why they had safety lamps. This is why various things that could cause sparks were banned. If there was any electrics in these mines, they were very, very highly covered up. So the chances of igniting the slightest bit of methane were kind of eliminated, or at least they should have been. Because on May the 24th, 1901, the day shift had just finished. A night shift had gone down, a couple of hundred people. The day shift were on the way home, when all of a sudden they heard a huge explosion. The sound of splintering wood and shattering metal alerted the people that there's something pretty significant had happened, and they turned instinctively and rushed back towards the pit. As I say, because the night shift was down, the casualty rate was lower than it could have been. There were 82 men and 52 horses died in that explosion. There was one man pulled out alive, a gentleman called William Harris. He was badly burnt, and he had, I think it's fair to say, what we would now know as PTSD. He genuinely believed for many years that he was the only person in that pit, and everybody was out. Everybody else was out safe. The inquiry found that there was too much coal dust and too much build-up of fire damp with the potential for sparking, and huge amounts of recommendations were made for improvements. The pit was sold in 1910 to the Lewis family, who have another pit known as Lewis Merthyr. They were quite a well-known established mining group and started putting in some of the recommendations from the disaster in 1901. But it wasn't enough, because on the 14th of October 1913, it happened again, and this time it was catastrophic. At 8:10, there was a phenomenal explosion which rocked the ground. The sound again of shattering wood and metal being torn apart filled the air. The pit manager at the time, Edmund Shaw, rushed to see what had happened and was greeted by the sight of the cage having been blown out of the pit, through the roof of the pit head, and tangled itself into the headgear. There was nothing left of it, and unfortunately, on the way past, it cost the life of one of the banksmen. He was the first to die that day, the first body to be taken away, but there were many more to follow. Shaw descended down the other shaft, and what greeted him was horrendous. Part of the pit was on fire. There was smoke and dust everywhere. He quickly arranged for water to be brought down, for extinguishers to try and extinguish the fires, to get through, to try and see what they could do and how they could pull people out to safety. All sorts of things happened. That a pipeline was run up to a reservoir, which is up in the hills up over there, to get water down. An emergency railway was laid up in the hills to cut turf, to bring it down, to again try and bolster out and get some of this fire out. Shaw himself stayed down way too long. Men were coming down, doing a bit and going back out again. He stayed, and the next day the medical teams had to prise his eyelids open from all the dust and smoke that had affected him. The call went out to help, and the rescue teams from the various pits around South Wales responded. This picture shows one of the teams from Universal Colliery, but unfortunately there wasn't much they could do because they were down there. And in fact, 2 of the men in this picture lost their lives that day. The rescue teams did what they could, trying to get the men and boys out safe and alive. But for many, it was too late. One side of the mine had completely collapsed and was totally inaccessible. 438 men and boys died as a result of the explosion, either in the mine or having been pulled out of it. There was one rescuer who also died as a result of a rock fall as he tried to reach some of the stricken men. And I've already mentioned the poor banksman who was killed by flying debris when the lift shot out the shaft in the initial explosion. 440 in total deceased. But it went beyond that. There was 542 children suddenly became fatherless, and on top of that 205 women suddenly found that they were widows. The shockwave went through Senghenydd, Aber and far beyond. As the day went on, the horror was fully felt across the valley, a sense of dread and terror and grief which I have never experienced, and I don't think I ever will. This is the National Mining Memorial, and you can see here the names of the victims of the 1901 disaster, the victims of the 1913 disaster. There are names on here which resonate round the valleys, surnames with old Welsh names: Jones, Evans, Davis, a lot of Davis. All of them perished that day. Some of them 19, 20, 21, some of them old timers 15. But here we have Morgan Edwards, aged 16. The youngest was 14. There was some positive news. They found that one of the areas down in the mine in the east side, called Botanic, there was fresh air coming out of it. They sent a rescue team down and they found fresh horse dung. They found a pit pony alive, covered in black dust, and they realised there may be hope. This rescue team from Rumney headed down there as part of the rescue crew, and they pulled out 18 people alive. But sadly, they also found 20 bodies. The cry went out for support and help, and communities rallied round. The churches, the chapels, the schools. St John's Ambulance Hall became a temporary hospital, and the Salvation Army were present, as they were in 1901. The soldiers and lasses, as they were officially called, rallied round to comfort, to support, to feed, and to try and give hope where there wasn't any. Funerals started to take place. For some, they were quite lavish because there were soldiers, ex-soldiers from the Boer War who had been killed. And they had funerals with full military honours. But for others, it was more modest, but no less poignant. The villagers turned out to pay their last respects, and the graveyards around Pennyroyal and Aber, and even as far as Cardiff, filled up. One of the most poignant images of that day was this one. It's incorrectly titled because it says a little mother waits for news. She wasn't. She was a 13-year-old girl, and The child in her arms is her sibling, her sister. Her parents had told her, wait for us, we're going to find out news, and they'd rushed to the pit head. And she stood and she waited and she watched and she prayed and she hoped. And today she still watches and is still waiting. She was called Agnes May Webber, and her sister was Gwyneth, aged 9 months. This was carved by a gentleman called Di Edwards, and it's in memory of all the widows and the orphans who were left behind, standing, watching and waiting. It is fair to say there was a significant number of women and children who became widows and orphans that day. It was absolutely dreadful. And what has to be remembered with Agnes here, at the age of 13, some of the people who were down the pit she would have known, possibly from playing in the streets, from school, friends, possibly even relations. Some of these boys who died were very young. The impact across the valley would have been horrendous. There were some streets and rows of houses where every single house, somebody died. In some cases, multiple people died. And it wasn't just from this area. There was one family who were from Hertfordshire. The mother had died, and the father and son had moved to Senghenydd to work and to mine coal to make some money. And what had happened is both of them died, and all of a sudden a 16-year-old girl is head of the family. The cry went out for help, and to be fair, people responded. Various different trusts from various different places donated money, and a series of trustees came together to distribute it. Widows were given allowances depending on the size of their families, and there were conditions attached. They had to remain chaste. They had to not be married. One woman was found to have been receiving money from a soldier who was at the front, 5 shillings a week. Her allowances were instantly stopped. But at the same time, the trustees funded all sorts of things, including uniforms for nurses who were just starting work. What was surprising was 3 years later, the pit reopened. It was a case of that some of the miners did go back down, but a lot didn't. They got jobs elsewhere or doing other things around the colliery. But for many, it became again the mainstay of work. The final injustice to the miners of Senghenydd happened on the 30th of March 1928. They were quite literally told, pack up your bags, take your tools home. The pit's closing, there's no jobs here tomorrow. After all that happened in 1901 and 1913, they were literally given 1 day's notice. The actual pit itself was bought by Powell Dufferin in the 30s, who used it for ventilation for other pits. It never mined coal again, and it became derelict. These images are taken in the 1960s and shows the site. They were cleared in the late 60s, and in 1974, finally, the shafts were filled with rubble and the top concreted over. Today, apart from this memorial garden and a school behind it, there is just literally a big empty space where once Universal Colliery was. If you're in the area, I would recommend a trip to see the garden. It is very poignant, quite peaceful, with the sound of a school in the background. The names of all the miners who are no longer with us, the memorial in the middle. And one more thing, when people say, oh, we should reopen the pits, I would just bring them here. Because along this path, every single tile is a pit, a colliery, and every single one of them lists the number of fatalities. Some of them 7, 5, 9, 6, but in some cases 33 fatalities in 1905 and 31 in 1965. 1838, 15 fatalities, and so it goes on and on and on. It is fair to say that Welsh mining was not a safe business. The other thing I would say is that if you are in the area and are visiting, drop in to see the Aber Valley heritage centre. It's down in Senghenydd. It's got a lovely room in which there is memorabilia and relics from Universal and from Windsor and from the mines, and talking about the disasters at the time. They are genuine lovely people, and it is just generally worth a look in. The other thing as well, while you're there, grab a copy of this book, which they sell in the centre. It's called The Valley of the Shadow. It's by John H. Brown, and it tells the story of both 1901 and the 1930 disasters in depth. It's a harrowing read, but it's a fascinating one. And it goes through what happened on those 2 fateful days and afterwards. You can get it from the community centre. Go visit them and go give them your money. It's not an easy story to tell, but I couldn't come to Senghenydd and walk the Aber branch and not tell it. Others have done so far better than I, but I just wanted to pay my tribute to the men and boys who died in both 1901 and in 1913, and to all the collieries around South Wales. I will be out doing some more soon. In the meantime, please like, comment, subscribe, and until next time.